Come on, England. You might have noticed there's a football competition going on, and one day before a ball is even kicked, is usually the high watermark for any English person's sense of optimism. It's only when we start playing that we get depressed. So what better way to celebrate this optimism than to have a Regcast? And today we're talking about the business of IT. My name's Tim Phillips, and to help us with the business of IT, our special guest today from Microsoft is Mark Taylor. Good morning, Mark.
Morning. Yeah.
Good morning. Now, Mark, what do you, at Microsoft, you're the wizard of the dribble for this sort of subject, isn't it? What do you do at Microsoft?
The wizard of the dribble?
Yeah.
I don't think I've been called that before.
Oh, yeah.
I run the developer and platform group for Microsoft in the UK. We're responsible for developer tools, but also new and emerging technologies. And a lot of the technologies that support this new revolution in computing, cloud computing, are ones that I'm very interested in at the moment.
Right, I'd stick Wizard of the Drizzle on your dribble on your business card. It's shorter. And also from our old mates Freeform Dynamics, Martin Bites Your Legs Atherton.
Good morning.
You were a football player in your youth yourself, weren't you, Martin?
I was a goalkeeper, believe it or not.
You see, with the state of England's goalkeepers at the moment, if you'd have just kept it up, you could be out there instead of in here. But that's not to say we're not glad you're in here.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I had to put that in. OK, before we get started, just the normal stuff about the interface that you see above my head here. So you've got the little tab for asking questions, or else sending us little messages about, predicting results, who's going to win the World Cup. But most of all, asking questions. Please do that. If you don't ask the question, I can't answer it. I can't ask it to them because I'm an idiot. And so then they won't answer it, and then you get frustrated. You can see our bios. You can download the presentation to look at later. You can also give feedback at the end. And so please also do that. If you do, you give us your feedback, we do more of what you like. We don't just ignore it, like some people do. Just before we get started, to celebrate what's going on in South Africa. South Africa's innovated in many interesting ways, including the fact that one person saw an ostrich one day, thought, what would it be like if we skinned it, we rolled it in spices, and then we cut it into really small slices, and then we left it out to dry. And from that came ostrich biltong. So it's actually quite small, so it must be the little baby ostriches that did this.
You might regret doing that. It's kind of chewy.
It's definitely spicy. We've got to try some.
Go on then.
Go. You try. Terrific.
Will you take responsibility if we want
It's a little leathery, it has to be said.
Mark.
Martin.
It's not bad, though.
No, Martin, please. Tell us why we're talking about the business of IT today. This is kind of all this stuff about returns on investment and who pays for what, is it?
It's kind of, frankly, it's sort of everything. And we're going to sort of acknowledge that. We've not just invented, well, we have invented a new term, business of IT, but it's not a new discipline. It's not anything that we need to go out and get our heads around and spend loads of money on and do loads of investing and all that kind of stuff. But I will sort of explain what we mean by that. And nobody needs to be sort of too alarmed. It's the stuff that, it's a list of things that we already know, that we already do. However, there's a good reason why we're talking about it today.
I was going to say, because if it's the stuff we already do, people are saying, well, I've been doing this for years, this is what IT does.
It's context. There's a bunch of stuff that's been happening for the last couple of years.
Take a drink of water.
Yeah,
it's leathery, isn't it? I'm
Snacks are good. Anyway, moving on. There's a bunch of things that are happening and have happened. Some of it's to do with technology, but majority of it is to do with essentially economics, economic conditions, business conditions, impacting business requirements, which impact the requirements we have of technology. So we'll talk a little bit about, once we've sort of established what we're, this business of IT thing, we'll talk about, well, what's changed and in what context are we talking about this. And then to sort of narrow it down quite a lot from talking about the world, we've just pulled out 4 key shifts, which we think are pretty interesting and important from an academic point of view, but also offer up quite a lot of opportunities for IT to step up and do a bit of business leading, both for to generate some of the things that we're trying to achieve, but also to protect its own backside. And we'll get to that, and then we'll wrap up with, well, okay, so what are the things that are important to think about and perhaps go and do?
And so, Mark, from your point of view, because you're involved with the new stuff at Microsoft, is there a sense that this is changing the way that IT has to be paid for and the way it possibly is going to make money back for the people who are paying for it?
Absolutely. I think one of the sort of biggest differences between this wave and any other wave of IT is that the business leaders read in The Economist or the FT that these wonderful promises that things like cloud computing can deliver. So you hear things like cutting your IT costs by 50% or turning all your IT costs from a CapEx item to OpEx. So the pressure that's being put on the IT departments now to try and deliver those economics is like it's never been before, and obviously accentuated by the current economic conditions.
So it's driving people crazy, because I know we get this response from the Reg readers that they come in on Monday morning and there's an email for them to say, I hear we could save all this money, why aren't we saving it?
Yeah, when can we start saving it? Yeah.
We're going to look at we're going to acknowledge some facts, and a big fact is that while bits of what you've just been talking about are universally true, they are not at the moment universally applicable in every single company, and that's the risk that we're trying to help IT sidestep and say, look guys, there are a number of things that we can do. There are also, if we're going to do them, we've got to make some changes, and essentially that's what this whole thing's about. So starting from the top, the business of IT, what the hell's that? Well, like I said a moment ago, it's the stuff that we do. It's not necessarily the technology, but it's everything else on top of it. So it's how we approach it, how we think about it, where we get it from, how we get it, how we pay for it, how we run it, how we manage it, how we use it. Very importantly, how we report on it. That was missing from the original list, and one of our guys called that out. Incredibly important, and we'll come back to that. And of course, how we get rid of it. And it's all that stuff in terms of the technology that we use in our business. And I love that graphic, because that kind of sums up quite a lot of the sentiments that we'll be talking about.
I'm not terribly good with metaphor, so what's it saying?
It's saying that there's money locked up.
Oh, yeah, I got it now.
Or value locked up, or something that can be freed and perhaps used more appropriately.
OK. Let you off with that.
Some waggle say, why don't you just pull it out the side? And that's probably quite an interesting metaphor for perhaps the uncontrolled use of some of the things that we'll be talking about.
Stick with the real stuff, not with the metaphors.
All right. We will get on to that.
OK.
So that was, well, if you like, a little intro to the things that we're sort of thinking about in terms of what we're calling the business of IT. So what's changed? Why are we talking about it right now? Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that we've been talking about this stuff, since IT and business have sort of formed that kind of relationship, if you like. Yeah. It's simply become more obvious, more apparent, more immediate. The economic climate places certain requirements on businesses to do things more effectively, but also more efficiently. Now, that effectiveness versus efficient thing is very two very different things, easily confused, I think. So on the one hand, effectiveness is about doing things, better. Doing things more efficiently, hopefully, means spending less money, ultimately. But what we're talking about here is not just about protecting the bottom line. We're also talking about trying to think of more effective ways to enhance the top line, e.g. Can we make investments that are going to add business value and let us sell more, or let us keep more customers, as opposed to, well, we're doing the same thing now and it's cheaper.
But that's really above IT's pay grade, though. That's the problem, though, Martin, isn't it?
Well, not in terms of how you do it. And this goes back to what Mark said right at the start. There's a bunch of things out there that are turning people's heads, and a lot of the assumptions can be true. They're not necessarily true. We're going to get into this, but the point, the sort of challenge for IT is to actually help business understand which bits are relevant to them today, and perhaps which bits are relevant, going forwards, and the changes that they might have to help business get their heads around in order to actually take advantage of them. So IT is fundamentally involved here.
If you consider the kind of sound bites that the business decision makers will have about this technology, it's, well, suddenly it's all in a data center that is not, we don't have to pay for. So it's somewhere else. And that's very alluring, because there's an opportunity to cut real estate costs. But of course, the other thing is that in that data center is your data, which may well be proprietary, which may well be subject to regulation about where it can be stored and how it can be used. And so this drive towards this kind of computing paradigm is exposing all of these problems, and actually does put IT right back in the centre of the debate. IT, over the years, with this move from centralised mainframe systems to client-server and departmental systems, again, IT had to adapt at that point to cope with both this proliferation of systems, a security model that encompassed them all, And what we're seeing again is the need for IT to be able to accommodate, where appropriate, some of these new technologies, but at the same time ensure that the company doesn't, break its own operating model or break the law through some sort of regulatory breach. So I think it really does pitch IT back in the centre of it.
I want to say one thing before we go on any further. This set of things that we're going to be talking about in a moment, we've called out 4 of them, and we're going to get there, and we're going to start with the first one in a moment. It is not all, I want to make this very clear to everybody watching, it is not just about cloud computing. Now, it's fair to say that we're having some or perhaps all of these conversations because of it, but it's not just about this thing we're calling cloud, and we're going to see that there's quite a lot of interesting stuff happening that isn't cloud. But the changes, anyway, I've sort of said it, it's partly because of, but it's not about it.
Okay.
Makes sense?
That makes perfect sense. There's just one thing before we sort of get onto this. It's a bit of a problem for IT. I still got biltong in my throat. It's a bit of a problem for IT sometimes that it has to be disappointing on these things when people become excited about the world that they've been reading about because journalists like myself happen to write about it sometimes, and then the IT has to say that doesn't really suit us right now, that's not going to pay, that's not going to be easy enough, that doesn't give us enough flexibility. What we're saying is let's just here's how to arm yourself with some facts. Is that what we're saying here?
I certainly think there's some good points that will come through today, which gives IT those options to present.
Yeah.
But I think that's the classic challenge with IT. You're always managing the expectations of the business because they think IT can operate in the same way as it may do in a consumer environment or some completely unrelated organisation. So the job of IT is to say, yes, of course we want to embrace this technology and use it to create advantage or increase efficiency, but there are always challenges and there's always a path that you need to take, which might not be the perfect one for the business.
Okay, well, let's have a look at good paths then.
So just to wrap up this last little bit, IT is involved because the way businesses are today, they're fundamentally reliant on IT to do their stuff. Therefore, by default, IT is involved, like it or not. There's a little bit of we've got to just get on with it. That there's a bunch of things that IT does need to sort of, call out, and there may be an element of shooting the messenger involved here, absolutely, but the voice of reason has got to come from the guys that completely understand how the business works from an IT point of view.
Yeah, great. If
any different.
For people watching this, if you're under pressure in any particular area or this sounds like your life at the moment, do let us know about that, and then we can make sure that we focus on the sorts of things that you're getting beaten up about.
So we said that we'd call out four sort of biggies. The first one everybody watching is going to be very familiar with because I reckon 99.99% of them have at least had a play with virtualization technology. So key shift number 1, the big decoupling, sounds a little bit grander than it really is, but essentially what we're talking about is the idea of virtualization allows us to decouple the software from the hardware that it runs on. Now, if you step back, well, that actually broadens out what you can think about. It actually means, well, that means that the applications could be moved around, they could be running somewhere else, separate from the infrastructure that's supporting them. Step back even further and turn that idea on its head, well, surely that means that if the apps are not stuck to the infrastructure in a traditional sense, then maybe the infrastructure itself could be moved around or put elsewhere and perhaps become a more sort of fluid entity than it is now. At the moment, we've got users, application, server, storage. Now, somebody once said, probably a Reg reader, what's wrong with silos? At least they work, and you're absolutely right. But that's also how budgets are carved up. By line of business, by department, by users, by application, whatever. And we're going to see quite shortly that the way that things are at the moment are not geared up to let us take advantage and deliver the things that Mark said right at the top of the show that we're actually trying to deliver. So we'll get to that. So something worth calling out here is that it's early days. Now, we got a bit of stick from some consultants saying, but this is all we do, this is everything we do. That may be true in terms of helping people virtualize their infrastructures. The facts are that it's the classic bell curve model. You've got leaders at one end, laggards at the other. By default, that means everybody else is between them. Millions of companies out there, and the measurements that we've done with the register audience and outside of that suggest that actually, in reality, whilst there's lots of this virtualization going on, in particular, right at the sort of the bottom end, if you like, consolidation of x86 server estates, it's still quite early days, and you can see that on the chart. So even organisations that we have called progressive, we'll come on to what that means in a minute, but essentially, if you like, the leaders, around 30-odd% are saying, yeah, we've done all that. We've virtualised our standard server estate, server infrastructure. 40% are saying, yeah, it's current priority. And 20-odd%, 25%, 26% are saying it's something that we're going to be doing in the future. Great typo there, but sorry about that.
Yeah. Okay, Mark. So, I mean, but so far it's so much sort of basic virtualisation. This thing. How does this change the way in which people obtain future budget? I guess it's easier to, if you're virtualising on current hardware, there's no big spend here. But you know, when you're looking at planning for the future, I suppose this changes the way in which you plan.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing in terms of the hardware manufacturers and chip manufacturers, that it's very much driving towards being a platform for virtualisation now. So you are seeing that move toward it. But actually, in many ways, that's out of step from the way ITs or suppliers to IT departments operate, because typically a project would consist of, here's some hardware, here's some network, and here's some software. And actually now, if they say, well, actually the project consists of some software on a virtualised environment with the hardware already done, it changes the economic patterns, particularly for system integrators and other suppliers, who very often are very substantial resellers of some of these pieces of hardware and network as part of their whole proposition.
But is this really so different? Because, I mean, a lot of guys, especially any of the guys above, you know, the medium-sized businesses and above, they've got a data centre already, which is stuffed full of the servers that they're buying. Is it really all done this way? You know, sort of getting budget from the accounts department or getting budget from the sales department?
I think that's the way it has been, to be honest. I think that everything has been seen as silos and being discrete. And I think this move toward virtualised environments is certainly, again, it changes the pattern of how IT is procured, both internally and externally. I think it's a very positive move. I think what it does do is drive to a much greater efficiency within hardware, which means it's a lower energy requirement, you need smaller data centres, and your hardware can be used for more general purpose applications rather than having one box doing one job. So I do think actually the move is very healthy. But, you know, I think what's happening with virtualisation is it's becoming a part of technology as opposed to the answer. So for a number of years, as virtualisation grew into its maturity as it stands now, then that was the goal, is to virtualise. Well, actually, the goal is to drive cost out or increase efficiency or reduce energy costs through various methods, one of which is virtualisation.
It's a means to an end, is essentially what you're saying, isn't it, Mark? Now, what we've talked about so far in terms of virtualisation, you're right to call out, it doesn't actually fundamentally change much just yet. But if you step back for a moment and think, right, hang on a minute, we used to have one server or a couple of servers per app or service or whatever. We've now got, and there's some funny things going on because virtualisation is actually driving server sales, which sounds a bit weird, but it is, because if you've got, for argument's sake, 500 old servers, it might make more sense to run the same stuff on 10 or 20 bigger, newer, purpose-built servers. So there's a little bit of sort of stuff going on that maybe initially is a little bit counterintuitive. Hang on a minute, I thought I needed less servers. Well, you do, but maybe it makes sense to buy some better ones. So there's that sort of thing going on. But what is giving us the opportunity to fundamentally change the way that we cost things out is that you can start thinking in terms of pools of resource rather than discrete resources for individual applications. And it's at that point where budgets from the sort of the traditional age don't make sense, because all of a sudden, if you've bought an app and it's going to sit in a virtual machine on a big server or a bigger server that's running some other applications, you don't need to buy the whole server. You might want to think about, well, these guys are going to use it for this much amount of time. Is there a way that we can bill them for that amount of time? There's always going to be a fixed underlying cost, e.g. it costs this much to, you know, have these servers on at once. But if you're starting to think in a little bit more of a lateral sense and sort of looking over the silos sort of thing. It's like, we've got a pool of, this is going forwards a little bit, but not too far. We have a pool of compute resource, of capability. We've got a pool of storage, and at any one time, I may or may not be using it. Now, we're going to talk about sort of on-demand and that kind of dynamism and flexibility in a moment. And the reason that we've separated it out is because most organisations actually have relatively fixed and relatively stable use cases for, I mean, think about, I don't know, if you've got 50p working on an SAP application, that's what they do 9 to 5, right? So that, the patterns aren't going to change that much. But there's other cases, and we'll come to those, where a pool of resource and dipping in and out of it does make sense, but it doesn't make sense across the board, and that's the sort of the challenge that we're talking about. If business assumes that everything can go over there in the cloud and it's not our problem anymore and we can have whatever we want whenever we want it, that's the kind of thing that IT needs to sort of mitigate against, because that isn't true. But it is going to be true in certain cases, and we'll get to that. So, key shift, number one, the big decoupling. It makes us think a little bit more broadly, a little bit more laterally in terms of the resources that we've got to play with. And like I said, the guys watching this are going to be very familiar with this, even if they've only just started.
Okay.
Related, you were going to say something.
No, I was going to say nothing. I was going to say what's key shift number 2, basically.
Key shift number 2 is financing and payment models.
Okay, so we've been edging onto this haven't we?
Absolutely.
It's been the unspoken thing. Are we saying that the guys have got to just write a new spreadsheet?
Well, I'm all for keeping things simple and practical and achievable. So, yes. I mean, really.
Let's move on to number 3.
Not quite as literally as straightforward, but actually in some cases it could be. It's about looking at the sums in a slightly different way. Now, this kind of thing's only going to work if you can talk to the business about it. You can't just send them a bill one day saying, you guys used that for 14 hours last week, here's your bill. It's like, hang on a minute, we paid for that 3 years ago. So it's not as literal or as, flick a switch and overnight, right guys, we're using this spreadsheet today and haha, they're going to copy it. So it's not like that. But there are some interesting things going on, and again, this is partly because of the cloud thing, but it's not just about that. So think about the things that we've done traditionally. We've bought servers. There might be the same company that might be quite happy to let you rent them. That means no capital expenditure up front, but you will be paying them a chunk of your total budget over time. Now, that's got nothing to do with cloud. That may simply be a more appropriate way of accessing servers or software or whatever. Again, nothing to do with cloud, right? The organisations that you currently pay upfront for whatever it is that you're paying them upfront for may be very happy to continue taking your money over time rather than in big lumps. And there are some interesting assumptions that go along the lines of if I do go to this sort of, if you like, monthly or pay-as-you-go model, it's going to be cheaper. And we, before anyone gets a slide rule out and starts making measurements and areas under curves and things like that, we have measured this properly, and there is, so this is just an example of how traditional on-premise software licensing, you can see at the start you take a big hit. There's going to be, systems integration, consulting, implementation stuff. So your costs are quite high for the first sort of year, 2 year, 3 year, depending on what it is. And then it will tend, hopefully, downwards slightly. I suspect the curve shouldn't be as steep as that over time. Now, what this doesn't show, of course, is upgrades, because then you get another spike. But sort of
back of the envelope.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can. Sorry,
I think it's a pretty. If you consider the organisations that outsource their IT, very often the kind of deal that they'll expect back from the outsourcer is this shape: is that we no longer want to, if we're outsourcing a desktop estate or if we're outsourcing our data centre, we no longer want to worry about these divisions between hardware, network, software, operations and so on. We want to pay, I don't know what it would be, £1 a user a day, for instance, and that's everything that they can eat. And so the outsourcers actually have got their head around this. Now, the way they deliver it, it could be nothing related to, quotes, cloud computing or virtualisation. It's an economic model for them, is that over what period can we recover our costs that we've had to put in, recover the expenditure we've made around creating this billing model, and then start making a margin. And that's one of the reasons why the most compelling outsourced projects really run over or deals run over 10 years, because it's probably year 7 before the outsourcer sees any real return through this model.
Of course, one of the challenges of the sort of the old way of doing it is that the assumption is that perhaps nothing much is going to change over that time, when we know that that's just totally not true, and unless that expectation for change is built in from the start, that's just a headache waiting to happen down the line, because you may do a merger and acquisition, all of a sudden you've got twice as much requirement, that's a change request, that's going to cost you a hell of a lot more, etc., etc., etc. Now, these things...
I understand this thing, guys, but I've got to stop you here. How much of the financial planning of this falls to the IT department? A lot of this would seem to fall, the IT department reports on what can be done. The finance people, then they get involved and they talk about returns.
I think there's a significant responsibility on IT for this, because particularly if there is no, as I say, there may not be an underlying on-demand cloud virtualized infrastructure. It might be their traditional IT environment, but their customer now wants to pay for it in a different way. So for IT to ensure that in doing this they don't, that their economic shape changes significantly, we've got to make sure that, there might be, as that chart actually illustrates, how do you cope with the short-term impact? And then how do you wait for the long-term return? Because it does completely change the shape. If IT is procured in a classic way, you get paid, you do a project, you get paid a bit more, and everybody's happy. But nowadays, with this kind of much more, the cloud economics, if I can use that term, I don't mean cloud computing, it's just very, very different. And IT just have to work out where cost is incurred and where value is created. And I think that's very much within the IT department.
And don't forget, we're not just the previous thing that we were talking about was virtualization and how that allows you to think in terms of pools of resource. Some of these sort of things that we're talking about, and ultimately it comes down to the way that we account for the money that we spend on IT, are equally, if not more applicable, internally. As opposed to actually thinking about, isn't it the business's responsibility?
How you charge your internal customer.
Absolutely.
Is that realistic? Are people doing that now?
Some people are, yeah. I mean, call it chargeback, call it what you want. But yes, it's starting to take hold. I wish I had some numbers to say that 13% of large organisations in this market are doing chargeback, but we know that some of the progressive ones are.
Would you recommend it?
Why not? With lots of caveats, such as the way that you manage things right now probably aren't going to let you do it. The way that you report on performance and what the thing does that someone's using are not going to be conducive to letting you say at the end of the month, right, guys, you did this many transactions and we let you sell, because of this service you were able to sell this much stuff or retain this many customers. Those metrics they don't exist in most organisations. It's usually this server was up for this amount of time, response time was this. But if you add those things up, it doesn't actually mean much to a business guy.
It doesn't come out of
send them a bill that's like, what the hell's this? So there are some changes that need to take place. And again, it's something that IT can help with, because it might be their spreadsheet ultimately, but unless they've got a handle on actually what are the things that are important to those guys, and you can make that up. You can take a guess, but what's the point? So some of this does come back to what we end up talking about a lot is communication.
How does it work inside Microsoft, Mark? Do you get charged for the
Totally, yes. We've got an IT department, and they work with a very large estate of people and equipment. And as you can imagine, some significant proportion of that estate are users that think they're pretty expert, so are very quick to start adjusting and pulling things around. So I think that we've got as big a IT challenge as anybody.
But it's, but in terms of sort of like, cost in it, do you, where do you, when did you how do you get involved in this sort of thing? Do you, does your department get charged for the amount of computing that it uses?
I think we are, you'd recognise our model in exactly the same way as any other organisation. But I do think that there is this, we're beginning to see this kind of entrepreneurial thinking coming out of this, powered by this new discipline, where people say, well, actually, I don't want to pay so much a day for my PC. Actually, what I want to pay is for a 2-second response time. And anything that falls within that 2-second response time, then I'll pay for. Anything that falls outside of it, I'm not going to pay for. But there's a premium for getting it inside. So what that, again, does is gives IT the opportunity to be entrepreneurial and say, well, where does our risk live in this? And actually, where's the break even? Where's the upside? So I do think it gives IT a much more creative way of doing it, particularly when you've got telemetry at all these different points, so you can measure what's going on in your data storage environment, in your server environment, your network, and so on. And you can really judge where that risk or where the challenge to deliver that response time lives.
But you can't do that stuff if you've got one box per application. So whether or not IT ends up giving the thumbs up for doing things in this way, IT is certainly responsible for enabling it to happen. And that goes back to the previous one about virtualization and thinking in terms of pools of resources, because otherwise you can't do it.
So some of this is a little bit more sophisticated. Are we saying that IT managers ought to be training as accountants?
Ooh.
I'm not sure about accountants, but I do think
Well, at least getting some financial, some training on, training on costing and...
I think we're doing IT managers a disservice to think they don't think in this way. I think actually it's about freeing them up to say, can we offer our services in a different way through a different financial model? And for them, it's about, okay, then where does that transpose the risk into my business? How do I make sure that I don't go bust effectively offering a service like that? So I think it elevates the way that IT managers need to think to another level, which I think most of them would be very pleased to be doing.
Well, going back 30 years, a lot of them did think in this way, didn't they? Because that's very much what the IT department used to do at times, when you had a big centralised architecture on stuff.
Go on, say the M word.
No, I won't say it.
Oh, I'll say it then, mainframe.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We can, if you've got some guys and a mainframe, we can learn from those guys. There are lots of reasons why the mainframe should be a natural part of the sort of the continuum of choice that we have for running different workloads for different requirements. And yeah, these guys are used to virtualized infrastructures and running things as services and having very high levels of service and commitment and security and all the rest of it that are the attributes of the mainframe. Absolutely.
Trouble is that after the year 2000, we took all those guys out. We made them into biltong, didn't we?
Is that why it was so salty?
Yeah. Okay, so that's number two. On the financing and payment models, and I guess it's like you say, this is something that's a lot of people are concentrating on at the moment. If you don't, but here's the thing: for number one and number two, it's coming to my mind both. If you completely ignore these, what bad thing happens? If you live in denial,
yeah, sure. No, it's a good question. You're going to end up spending a lot more money than you otherwise could.
But no one's going to notice because you're in charge of...
Well, they are going to notice because they are noticing. So this is already happening. When Harry met Sally, it's already out there. And it comes back to what are the right places to do this, which is exactly what Mark said right at the top of the show. This is, everything seems possible. We've got to work out where it is possible and where it is practical, and not just sort of, run for the hills and think that everything's going to be all right if we send it all over there.
I think there's two things would definitely happen for those that ignore it. One is that the shareholders of the company will say, well, hang on a minute, what's going on here? How come other organisations are seeing this benefit and we're not? The other thing is, and I think this to an extent happened as the mainframe era was overcome by the client-server environment, was that departments will then decide to go and do it themselves. And without doing very much. I mean, in the client-server world, that would mean a department would need to get a server and do stuff, whereas now they don't need to do that. They could bring in a cloud service from a third party, and with actually very little technology could start doing it themselves. And we're back into a very, very significant, dangerous situation with things like security and regulatory environment then. So I think organisations that ignore it will ignore it at their peril.
Agreed. And the last point I want to make is that this is not just about spending less money, because that ignores a really sort of, you're missing a very big trick if this is only about saving money. And there's a great example of one of your customers, the Lancashire Constabulary. They did a huge desktop virtualization, VDI rollout. I think.
Oh, we had them in the studio.
Yeah, exactly. 5,000 desktops, I think it was. Quite a big project. And they did it because they had to. There was a regulatory element to this, and they decided that the way to do it was VDI. Now, if they had only looked at this from a cost point of view, they said they would never have done it and they're still having to take a 7-year view on the cost side of things just to make the sums work. So this is not just about making changes to save money, because in some circumstances you are going to spend a little bit of money in order to do that sort of stuff anyway. Now that's quite a good segue into the next...
Before you leave that slide, quick question from Simon. Cumulative cost, or is this cost per period?
Yes, Simon, cumulative cost. I should have said that. Thank you.
The cumulative cost can't go down, though, can it? It would go up, and then it would stop going
say that. Yes, I know. I knew someone would point that out. I hope the point is made that if you're
it'll cross. Even
at some point it will. Yes.
Even if it was cost per period, then the dotted line would be horizontal, wouldn't it? They'd still cross.
The dotted line is right. That's cumulative cost.
That's cumulative, yeah.
It's going up all the time, and the point is that at some point it's going to overtake the traditional on-premise licensing thing. We've measured it. It's not the best graph in the world. I appreciate. Thank you for calling that out and embarrassing me.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Good call. Good call. Cumulative cost.
And second one from Steve. If you take a 2-second response time and then you look at the contract with an on-demand supplier, you'll see you can never have a base from which to guarantee such a service level. So what do you think? Do you think
I think this is a great point. They've got this big thing called latency that sits in there that in many ways, because of the way networks are highly self-managing, there's only so much that you can do, and or you throw more and more hardware at the problem and suddenly the economics go out the door. So I think it's one of these things where there needs to be a pragmatic measure that you say that, yes, we can give a 2-second response time within a standardized environment, and as long as we stay within that, then everybody's happy. Whereas if you say, well, I'm now working, I don't know, in the outback of Australia through a satellite link, and I'm not getting my
2 seconds, yeah.
And, I think that, again, I think this is a very important aspect of any environment that's delivered in this way, is that the latency within the network becomes much, much more significant than it is in a traditional economic model for IT.
And let's be dead clear, 2-second response time for what? So if it's something that requires a sub 2-second response time and the supplier that you're thinking of using can't guarantee it, then you don't use that supplier, or you don't think about outsourcing that service, e.g. Trading platform, or something that requires a millisecond response time.
Or if you're doing it yourself, you don't guarantee it to the rest.
Well, if you are doing it yourself, then actually you are in more you are more in control of the things that do introduce latency into the whole thing. So
it's never mind training as accountants; they have to train as lawyers as well.
Well, not necessarily, but this is exactly what we've been talking about all along. It's about knowing which things are appropriate to do in which manner. Now, I called out that this should not be only about reducing costs, and the next thing I want to sort of touch on is outsourcing. Now, this is not about cloud, but let's acknowledge that cloud is another form of outsourcing. Let's be realistic about that. Different things, granted, or more choice and all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to touch on outsourcing because it's possibly something that I think a lot of organisations or people that think about it just kind of take it for granted. It's stuff that we don't want to do, so we'll let them do it, and hopefully they're better at it than us and they can do it for less money. But if that's the only sort of rationale of gravitating towards that sort of cost view when thinking about it, someone else has got the economy of scale or the expertise, they can do it better and cheaper than me, that is fair enough, but you're missing a big trick. And when we talk to organisations that we've defined as sort of progressive, and this is part of the research that we've been doing over the last couple of years, and what we mean by that is where IT is seen by the business as a partner, a leader, adding value to the business, as opposed to the other end of the scale when it's a cost and we don't like it that much and we put up with it and that kind of thing. So there's a spectrum there, and progressive we're talking about the good end, if you like, or the end where it's seen in a more positive light by the business. And when we talk to these guys with that sort of progressive view of IT, yes, of course, they look at cost, but they major on the fact that it helps them do things that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do as a business. Now, that sounds kind of really obvious when you say it out loud, but that's a much more sort of positive way of looking at not doing something. Than someone could do it for a bit cheaper than us.
It's a little bit more difficult to put a price on, though, isn't it?
We'll come to that, but think about if we don't do this, what can we do instead? So there's a reallocation of resources for a start. So an example there might be something like desktop support, right? 99% of desktop support is going to be, frankly, sort of monkey work, resetting passwords, all that kind of stuff. And you've got talented IT guys doing that kind of brain-numbing stuff, right? And They could actually be doing something else, like improving a departmental application, or do you know what I mean? Or managing stuff more effectively, or rather than being tied up in this thing. So that's an example of reallocating resources more effectively. The other thing that is worth thinking about is that by selectively outsourcing the right things, you can perhaps do something that's better, not just cheaper, and that could actually be help to impact the top line as well as the bottom line. So, e.g., optimize trading system, or optimize supply chain, something to do with supply chain, something external that actually helps you be more effective as a business, as opposed to just save cost. So this is not just about, or we need to think about outsourcing it in the bigger picture as not just about shifting something that they would otherwise do in-house externally. It's about hopefully taking something and making it better, and hopefully accessing some business value, if you will. There's a really simple analogy, which is, oh, sorry, love, I can't spend time with the kids this weekend because I've got to clean the windows. Right?
You're going to have to explain that to me again.
Well, it's about, why not pay the window cleaner a very small amount of money to do that chore, so you can go and spend quality time with the kids.
Okay, now, Mark, aren't the people looking at this, they've been thinking about outsourcing for about 10 years odd now? Aren't they going to be pretty much across this one?
I think outsourcing has been around for a long time. If you think about central government IT departments have been outsourced for many, many years. Mm-hmm. I think there's a fairly interesting debate that goes on in organisations that have outsourced, is that one of the early kind of premises would be, IT is not line of business for us. IT is just a support function. IT actually is really just this overhead, so we want to get it out the door. And I think a lot of organisations, having outsourced, realise actually that was the wrong thing, and they lose control. Or if they try and regain control, they're into the dreaded change control program, which means everything that was in fixed price suddenly becomes time materials, and it just becomes very expensive. And I think one of the things that I've seen in the industry is that many of these big IT outsourcing contracts never run their course, because there is some realisation down the line that too much control for something that actually is their line of business is either stifling innovation or really stopping the business moving forward. I think it's where, when outsourcing happens, as much as you need to get to the parts of it that really are the equivalent of cleaning the windows, and not the equivalent of the house itself. And I think that's the trick.
There's a big difference between knowing what the right things are to outsource versus, oh, that's a bit of a headache, let's get rid of it. Yeah. And again, it goes back to the difference between sort of being a progressive IT organisation or just a better organised one than a disorganised one. If you don't know what you've got in place, whether it's servers, switches, routers, you name it, all that stuff, and you don't understand the dependencies between them, and this application needs to talk to this application, which in turn informs this one, and some guy makes a really important decision at the end of the month. You don't know what those dependencies are. You don't know what you've got that you're supporting, yet you know that it's a bit of a headache, so let's get rid of it over there. Goes back to what you said, that loss of control potentially stifling the way you actually run your business. Now, we know that less organised companies either just don't outsource because they don't know, or they take inappropriate risks, but again, they don't know they're doing it. Yeah. And so either way, it's not necessarily a particularly good thing. Whereas, and this is sort of perhaps slightly counterintuitive, as we were discussing outside, the more organised companies with respect to how they run and understand what IT does for them, they're in a much better position to say, right, okay, so that bit, that can go over there, and that bit can go over there. These bits we need to keep in-house for obvious reasons. And it's done, in a sort of a sensible, controlled, consistent, and informed manner. And I think a lot of the government stuff that you just mentioned, and reasons why dissatisfaction creeps in quite early, and it's about a continual change management program in a negative sense, is why a lot of that's happened.
But also, when you talk about budgeting around these things, you get into this sort of could happen economics. We end up sort of like sounding like government ministers talking about all we have to do is create efficiencies, and then we solve a lot of problems in our budget. And experience is that it doesn't tend to come true, and it takes a lot of expertise.
I do think
this to come true.
There are a number of things that you could always apply when you think through outsourcing. One is, well, what happens if we merge with somebody else? And another thing is, what happens if we decide to open a new line of business? Or what happens if we launch a new product? If those things aren't encompassed within the outsourcing contract, then they become phenomenally more expensive. I would argue now any modern business who thinks that they can do one of those things without it having a massive impact on IT is naive, and I actually don't think they exist.
But to encompass that, for IT to drive that, that's a little bit above IT's pay grade.
Well, I disagree with you there. I think it's this thing about if you are going to outsource, then this is not a headache you're outsourcing. This is a massive part of your business. It is, you know, it is a fundamental driver of business now. And as I say, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any business of any size for whom IT isn't the fundamental engine of the business. And so it's a bit like saying if I was, you know, I'm whatever my core product, if I was making biltong, then I'm actually the manufacturer of biltong I'm going to outsource, and I'm just going to make the packet that it goes in. Well, you know, that you'd think very clearly about that, because at the end of the day, it's what's in the packet that's most important to your customers. And I think that you know, as I say, with outsourcing sometimes can just be seen as a way of alleviating a headache, and has sometimes some very alluring cost models associated with it. But actually it can really damage, if it's done wrong, it can really damage the opportunity for companies to progress. And you don't have to look very hard to find, if you look in sort of where IT outsourcing contracts have been broken early, and you can usually find it's because the limitations around the outsourcing contract stifle that kind of innovation, or stifle that ability to merge and acquire businesses or launch new products.
There's another reason why this should actually be in IT's face. The choice of things that we can now choose to outsource is much broader than HR or payroll or accounts or whatever. We're talking about servers and storage and processing and things like that. So all of a sudden the stuff that you either didn't do any of, or you did all in-house, little bits of these things, or lots of bits of these things, can actually be run elsewhere by someone else on your behalf. Various different levels of sort of, you know, what you can get from that. It's not just about cloud, but it is partly because of cloud. And we're going to actually sort of move on, and there's a little bit of so what.
We do actually need to move on.
Move on. Anyway, so the last key shift is this on-demand and pay-as-you-go thing. The on-demand being the salient point here, because we've already talked about looking at different types of financing and sort of costing models. This is worth calling out as a separate line item, so to speak, because it is actually sort of fundamentally different, and it is about paying for stuff that you use or do, and that's it. Not paying for the ability to be able to use it, you know, like a retainer or something, which is what you have for your mobile phone contract, for example. Actually, that's a good analogy. Why can't everything go to pay-as-you-go? Well, think about it. Does everybody use a pay-as-you-go mobile? Do they? Heck. Why? Because it's inherently miles more expensive. You pay a huge premium per call if you just want to buy X amount that you can use whenever. So there are certain areas, and we've measured some of them, and you can see that we've had to blow up the chart quite big to actually see where these things really sort of matter at the moment. This thing we've been calling elastic computing. Again, the business could easily have its head turned by listening to the stuff that's out there about everything can go to on-demand and everything can go to the cloud and you only pay for what you use. It makes sense, but the question is, for IT to help the business understand, where does it make sense?
How many people are actually doing stuff for which this is directly relevant?
Well, there's that, which then the answer is not many.
Not many.
But more appropriately, what is it that they are doing that fits this kind of this kind of choice, this kind of model? And we can see that, like I said, we've had to blow this up quite. This was only done a couple of weeks back, so it's brand new. Now, bear in mind, self-selecting audience. So I suspect that the percentages we are showing here are actually bigger than the world if we did a random sample. And you can see the types of workloads. Now, this is not surprising. But it might be surprising to a business guy that's sitting here wondering why we can't have this for everything that we do.
Yeah.
Actually, it turns out that the reality at the moment is we're using sort of flexible, scalable, elastic computing, whatever you want to call it, outside the organisation for periodic, for compute-intense workloads and for bursty workloads, i.e., this is a bit of a cheesy example, but you're an online florist the day before Mother's Day or the week of Mother's Day or whatever. You want double, triple the amount of processing capacity from whoever you get it from, Rackspace, whatever. And you want that because you know that in 5 minutes' time, 1 million people are going to try and buy flowers for their mum.
Okay, so Mark, this is right in your area, isn't it, this sort of stuff? How relevant is it?
I think it's a great example about this so-called bursty workloads, and they fall into two categories. There's these predictable workloads that you know, for instance, the week before Mother's Day and the week before Valentine's Day, your florist is going to have a requirement for a greater degree of IT, so you bring it in. There's other scenarios where you know you're going to get these bursts, but you can't necessarily predict when. And so again, the shape of your infrastructure to deliver that needs to cope with that. And again, the way that you would pay for it would be somewhat different. And then there's other.
But it's effectively tactical. This, it's putting a little bit aside because you know you're gonna need it on a rainy day.
Well, I don't think it's very tactical. I actually feel it's strategic, because if you're reliant on IT to deliver your service there, and you're not planning in a strategic way for it, then you're going to fall over at the first time.
That's the difference. You need a way of doing this in place, aka a strategy, but it doesn't have to be as grand as that, so that you can use this stuff as and when appropriate. That's the difference between IT saying, look guys, there are these things that fit this shape, therefore we need to be in this position to be able to do something about it, and by the way, it will cost this much if and when it happens, versus the business going, hey guys, Amazon server economics, why can't we have that in our data center, or why can't we have that for everything we do? And the answer is that it's completely impractical. It's probably irrelevant for half the stuff we do, because we want these guys to never ever worry about reliability, stability, availability, because what they do is the operations, the centre of our business, whether you run your business on SAP, Oracle, or whatever. Those guys, that's what they do day in, day out. Okay, There's no changes there. But
very briefly, then, very briefly, put some hard edges on this. It's something that's it's a bit of a rounding error at the moment. It ends up in the margins, this sort of pay-as-you-go model. If we're looking ahead a few years, how much of IT is it going to be relevant for, Mark?
Well, from the bottom up, I think we're seeing the concept of cloud driving very much different and interesting innovation within the hardware environment, within the network environment. Latency is something that's being looked at, and then you've got virtualization at operating system and application level. All of this is lining up to really deliver this highly elastic, on-demand capability. And there is no doubt that as these technologies become mature, that models like the pay-as-you-go model, or models like 2-second response time, as we mentioned, will become the norm. They will become the way that IT will be procured.
So most of the budget's going to be end up spent in this way.
Let's be clear, there's a slight difference between what we're talking about and what's being shown here. What's being shown here is this thing that we're calling elastic computing. So you have a short-term requirement and you get it, and then you don't need it anymore.
Yeah.
That's a lot different from what somebody is probably thinking out there. Hang on a minute, but that's different from software as a service, when you would pay a subscription fee over a period of time, and hopefully. If you need more people, you can have more seats, and if you need less people, you can have less.
But my point is, it all goes back into a model where you've got to know at any time exactly how much you've spent, how much you're projected to spend, whether that's these sort of things. You need much more information.
Absolutely.
But I think where this is going is both the technology and the business will drive it to something where you truly get it on demand. So infrastructure will scale up on demand to deliver the service levels, and customers that are using that infrastructure are going to say, right, I only want to pay for what I use, and I'm only going to pay you when I get it at this quality of service. So I think that's where we're going. Now, we're certainly not there yet, but I definitely think that's the direction the industry is moving in.
There are some sort of final summing up things that we could do. The first one and the most important one is, and we have actually been talking about this throughout the session, this requires all these things, and there are more than 4 of them, but we think they're the biggie. IT, I think we've demonstrated, does have justification to take the lead here, not just because it knows how to do it, But the point is the business doesn't, and the business may make some really inappropriate assumptions that may involve getting rid of half the IT department. Now, maybe some IT departments are far too big. Most of them we think are far too small. But the point is IT should not be sitting back and ignoring it, putting its head in the sand and letting these things happen to it. Yep. It's more a case of helping the business either. Well, not either, but one of the things to do is to rerun the sums. I mean, some of it really will be as simple as changing the spreadsheet. But the point is that
is there much help for rerunning those sums? Are we, are the people that give suggested models? What have we got in our further resources? Have we got anything that's going to help with that?
That's a good point, actually. We might be able to something there. One of the things that was obvious from the previous session, the consultant chap from Microsoft, his very presence actually got business guys.
Oh, he was the guy that came and sat down and people all talked.
Yeah, exactly. So I think some of this is going to be improved and helped by the presence of a third party. Now, that does not necessarily have to involve spending a ton of cash. Call it mediation, call it whatever you want, but the point is that unless IT can help the business understand what the real choices are in our environment and our business, and not just this generic everything is going to be cheaper and faster because it's being run by someone else's super optimized data center over there, is simply pie in the sky. But there are some really sensible and quite exciting opportunities for IT to step up and start delivering or deliver more of that value that the business knows it wants, yet is in a position that it can't really get to it because of the way that we've been doing things over the last 20 years.
Now, I've got a couple of questions here that have come in. Small businesses, Steve, surely most of the IT function, it would be best to outsource it. Now, we've just got to the stage that for small businesses, they don't need to keep a big IT department.
Definitely don't need to keep a big IT department. Many small businesses already outsource the maintenance of their environments. So somebody turns up in a white van with a DVD and puts it in a slot and reboots their server and charges them £500 or something. And I think certainly what small businesses are looking for, but we just don't want that anymore. We don't want this headache of having these servers which we don't really understand, which the guy down the road does, but he charges us every time, a bit like a plumber charges people to mend pipes. So I think that the opportunity for that to go somewhere else, for them to just purchase a service level, is definitely enticing for small businesses.
If you're a small enough business that you don't have, if you like, a lot of things that need joining up, then yes, that model is appropriate. But don't forget, obviously, at some point down the line, you might want to join things up, and you might want to bring some things back in house, and that is part of the sort of the risk or the challenge at the moment. If I send my stuff or part of my stuff over there, within a very short space of time, if I decide I don't want it over there anymore, can I have it back? That's quite important. And what you were saying there about some of these sort of cloud models or cloud economics are making people think that they can do things that without, they would never consider. Due diligence and risk management and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, just the final one was a question. Alex writes a slightly sad comment. He's in second, third line support. And what they've done is they've outsourced the first line support to give him more time to do the important stuff. Like, exactly like you're talking about. But what he's found is that he's spending more time hooked up on support because the people they've outsourced to really don't sort of take ownership, I suppose you'd say, of the problem. But it's going to stick like that until the cost of what they've done gets so high that it hits an alarm, sort of thing. And this is a budgeting problem with change, isn't it?
And I feel for Alex. I think this is a real challenge that when you see these big framework outsourcing contracts, obviously the supplier of it takes it to the lowest cost. And unfortunately, when you get the lowest cost, you're going to get the lowest quality as well. And unfortunately, he's suffering with that, and I do feel for him.
Yeah, but there's not really much you can do about that.
Well, I think in the end, this comes back and bites the organisation. Because in the end, enough of their users will complain or the service levels will go down, and suddenly you call in your supplier and say, look, we've got to renegotiate this contract because it's not working.
There is something you can do. Maybe Alex can't do it himself, but if you're not getting what you paid for, then that's a breach of contract. It's as black and white as that. And service providers are looking at ways of engaging with customers so that there's value on both sides. Now, it's not unreasonable to expect a customer to look at a service provider from that point of view as well. And yes, there's glossy stuff up front, but what's real is obviously what you end up paying for. And if you're not getting it, if you're not getting what you're paying for, then You've got to do something about it. You can't just, you know, that guy's going to go mad, and that's not fair.
Okay, we need to finish there, guys. We're out of time. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for your questions and your comments. No one goes away empty-handed on this. Mark, do you want to keep your biltong, or you can have a horn? Which do you prefer?
Well, since I'm going back on the tube, I think I'd much rather have the biltong than the horn.
But you see, you're getting a lot of conversations with that. In that case, Martin, you get the horn.
I have a 21-month-old who will find this fascinating.
You know, we try to help, and I get to keep the other horn. Terrific. And thanks very much for tuning in. We hope that's been useful. Send us your feedback. Download this. The little bit about the World Cup at the beginning will seem rather ridiculous if you've been watching this on demand, so we're sorry about that. But I've been Tim Phillips, and from this Regcast, goodbye.